This is the first television history of Australia's Special Air Service Regiment, our SAS. In periods of threat, Australians have always rallied to the defence of our country, and their fighting capacity, good humour and strength of character in times of peril is a matter of proud historical record. But since World War II, the nature of armed conflict has changed dramatically, and threats such as the spread of global terrorism are not easily dealt with in toto by conventional forces. It's widely recognised that special force units such as the SAS have an important role to play. Here is our story.
They operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox, and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep in enemy territory. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who set out to transform SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into Australia's force of first choice.
The philosopher Thomas Hobbes said that war is a combination of force and fraud. Conventional forces tend to focus on the delivery of force. Now, whilst the SAS also has that capability, it really lives in the world of fraud.
In this 10-part series, we take you on a journey through the history of SAS operations in both war and peace, starting with the rise of special forces in World War II. We penetrate the philosophy of the fearful SAS selection course and follow SAS into the savage jungles of Borneo and Vietnam. In response to the rise of global terrorism and asymmetric warfare, we'll see SAS reinvent itself as Australia's crack counter-terrorist force. Its versatility flourishes in third world operations in Timor and Africa. It weathers the Black Hawk disaster and the Tampa crisis. In the recent operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, SAS has excelled itself. Using rare archival and amateur vision, we examine the unusual, unorthodox military culture of SAS, a culture that relishes change and has continually reinvented itself to survive.
And it was brought down, I think, to 2 skills.
So eventually we got the new 6-wheel cars, and
it's very much an Australian story.
Through the men's own stories, we see the human side of these so-called super soldiers. We share how SAS soldiers think and what makes SAS so successful.
It tended to draw in a group of people that were high achievers and that didn't necessarily sit well in the rest of the army, that were looking for something different, and as soon as they arrived in the regiment seemed to find a place.
I really thought my chances would be slim because I'd had quite a checkered record up to that point, in that I had one case of drunkenness on my record, which was a red mark those days, and I'd had several charges for insubordination, failing to obey lawful command.
Right, what I've found with being in the SAS is it's not what's on your shoulders or your arms, what rank, it's what's up here, the way you've been taught, and what's up here thinking under stress, and what's in here. You've got to have that, otherwise you've got nothing.
The Australian SAS is the Army's hand-picked team of unorthodox troubleshooters, specialising in covert reconnaissance and surgical operations.
A small team of men inserted in a clandestine fashion deep behind enemy lines. and operating undetected for perhaps 3 to 4 weeks, collecting intelligence, conducting surveillance and reconnaissance, and then perhaps shifting its focus to harassment and sabotage before being pulled out successfully. Now that's the quintessential SAS operation to my mind.
The Australian SAS is widely regarded as one of the best elite special forces in the world.
But it remains true that every army in every age has had its elite soldiers, and these soldiers have always been distrusted or mistrusted by the ordinary soldier.
For much of its 50 years, SAS was the ugly duckling of the Australian Army, derided and distrusted. And probably the greatest feat of SAS has been its hard-won triumph of the flexible and the unconventional over the entrenched and the conventional.
One of the things is that the organisation, right from its outset, even from 1957 onwards, has as its genesis the idea of unconventionality, and in lockstep with that is the idea of being elite. Now, elite in the SAS description, this is my definition of it, is that it's not better than anybody else, it's just better than you were yesterday.
Well, in 1984, I had an honours degree in philosophy. There weren't many jobs around for philosophers. At that time, I was at 2 Commando in Melbourne, and I was reading Conrad's Heart of Darkness, on which they based the film Apocalypse Now. And in it, one of the main characters said if he had to choose between a soldier and a philosopher, he would choose being a soldier any day. So I applied for SAS.
Special forces are as old as soldiering itself. The Roman Praetorian Guard, the Boer Commandos, Australia's Commando Regiment, the American Green Berets, the US Navy SEALs, Indonesia's Kopassus, and Russia's Spetsnaz are all special forces.
I think the special forces in Australia has a long history. If you go back to the Boer War, guys like Blake and Morant were working small groups a long way from home, doing much the same thing as SS does today. We had, during the First World War, snatch teams and sniper teams who go out into no man's land and lay up and capture, either take prisoners or shoot enemy officers. The commandos, the stay-behind commandos in World War II in places like Borneo and New Guinea. They're the forerunners of what Special Air Service is about today.
Lawrence of Arabia in World War I was an archetype of the multi-skilled SAS soldier. Lawrence had studied the history, culture and politics of the Middle East, and he'd learnt Arabic. In advancing Britain's interest in the Middle East by raising an Arab revolt against Turkish rule, Lawrence was a truly political or strategic soldier. Much like the modern-day SAS.
I saw these guys marching around about 10 foot tall and with a red beret on their heads, and very smart, they just attracted attention, and I thought, who are these guys? And I asked one of the fellas there, one of my mates, and he said, it's the SAS selection team, it's the CO from SAS. And I said, what do they do? He says, they jump out of aeroplanes and all sorts of things. It's got to be good to get in them. I said, well, I am good. So I applied, and funny enough, everyone always tried to tell you that you weren't good enough. People in the office, a sergeant major said, you won't be good enough for them. They only take the best.
Straight your arm down. Keep it locked. Straight your arm down. Keep it locked. No, never be Rangers troopers. Come on, we're with it. Pace the pace, come on.
Selecting elite troops is a black art. In 1100 BC, the warrior Gideon had to select troops to fight the invading Amalekites and Midianites. Gideon tested them with a grueling march. When they paused at Harrod's Spring, most men lay down to drink. But 300 drank with only one hand while keeping watch. Gideon selected those 300 and with cunning routed the huge enemy army. Like Gideon, SAS avoids stereotyping and seeks out individualists with mental and physical stamina. Selection focuses on the generic traits of strength of character, sociability, intellectual honesty, integrity, self-discipline, and moral intelligence.
They go through a rigorous selection process in order to get the right quality of individual. And you know, there's many people say that, well, it's the resourcing that you enjoy and it's the equipment that you're able to apply and the type of training that you do. But without that building block, certainly Special Forces wouldn't be what they are.
What makes an SAS soldier? That's an unanswerable question. Everyone has their own opinion. But from my experience, what I've seen of these men, they're extraordinarily courageous, very intelligent, and have a persistence that just never quits.
They're drawn to the idea of being something other than themselves. And one thing you learn when you start to do selection courses, from either end, is you never, ever can ever understand the extent of human capacity to survive and be strong. And for every candidate that ever came on a selection course, there was always this cathartic moment, this one single moment, it'd be different for everyone, where they in themselves resolved that they would never come off this course except by on a stretcher.
In February 1974, I commenced that SAS selection course. And the first phase was across at Rottnest Island, during which physical fitness was tested in the extreme. I had to be retrieved from the bush when I'd run off the road on one of those hairy bends over there at Rotto and fell into the bush dead. Obviously the instructors brought me back to life, and after a 24-hour rest I was back on the selection course with what was left of the 156 people. 7 of us finally finished out of that 156.
SAS selection is open-minded, building a flexible, pluralist, postmodern organisational culture.
But we go okay.
The SAS selection course works by setting tough mental and physical tasks while depriving candidates of food and sleep.
Keep going, come on.
As fatigue and hunger take effect, the core lifelong personality traits inevitably emerge. SAS needs to see the default man, the basic person he is when he thinks no one's watching.
Yeah, they would try and wear you out, and that was well known, and it's exactly what they did. You're always hungry because you're so physical and you're so tired. You know, sleep was a critical commodity at the time. You'd try and snatch it whenever you could. And once they knew you'd all gone to sleep, they would deliberately get you all up and maybe do something like try and teach you Japanese at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Less than 20% of candidates make it through the course.
There was one final task, and it was known that if you made it to that final task, you'd essentially made it. I really had difficulties due to fatigue as to trying to work out exactly where I was. You know, when things like that happen, that essentially, well, that was your chance.
Yeah, the selection course was very good. It taught us quite a few new skills. Trying to move through the bush and jungle very quietly. We would occasionally practice by sneaking up on kangaroos that were having a siesta and try and get within a couple of metres of them before they woke up.
Now, one thing SAS has never countenanced is to reduce the standards for selection. In some respects, it's become tougher to get into SAS. And this is for good reason, given the great breadth of roles and tasks that are expected of the soldiers these days within the unit.
Any serving male member of the Army, Navy or Air Force may apply for SAS selection. However, anyone who refuses to parachute is automatically rejected. SAS selection eliminates glamour seekers and romantics with sickeners or cruel disappointments. A promised night off suddenly becomes a tough obstacle course. After an exhausting route march, the soldiers see their transport home drive off without them. For SAS selection, there is one unwritten quality that all applicants must possess.
You could be wet as a shag on a rock, lost, no food, half your patrol missing. Somebody would crack a joke and you would see the funny side of it.
During this selection process, each instructor had to have their own little gimmick to give the students some sort of awe or say, oh God, where does this man come from? And they'd be out in the bush, they'd be soaking wet and freezing cold and what have you. And what I used to be able to do was I used to carry a little umbrella hidden down the back of my pants, and of course I'd suddenly appear when the rain stopped. I'd be sparkling clean and dry and not cold or anything like that, and they used to amaze how I'd be able to do that.
The best way to pass was to have a smile in your face, no matter how cold, freezing, or whatever discomfort you were in. And I gave my particular patrol, which I was assessing, 5 minutes to camouflage up. This particular fella had not paid attention or whatever. He camouflaged himself up totally white. So I was confronted with a man with a totally white face. My jaw virtually hit the ground, and I remember saying to him, listen, do you know what you've done? And he said, no, I don't. I said, you have bloody camouflaged yourself all white. And within a second, and without any facial movements, he said, well, it's bloody cold enough to be snowing, ain't it? And that's a pass for humour.
We then had about a week off in Perth, where all we did was eat and go to the movies and eat and do something else and eat to put on all that weight. And we would eat until our stomachs were so extended we couldn't even move. And then half an hour later we'd eat again.
SAS selection has always bred resentment. SAS takes the Army's best soldiers, and critics ask, why create special forces when you already have the tough, dependable, eternal Aussie digger? The Australian SAS story begins in World War II, with the birth of the unorthodox British SAS. Hand-picked attack groups would travel 2,000 kilometres across the desert, destroying more Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground than did the Royal Air Force in the air. In Europe, SAS brigades caused such mayhem among the Germans that Hitler ordered all captured SAS to be executed. But the Australian SAS is also heir to the independent commandos who fought Japan in World War II and led the Timorese in a deadly guerrilla war that tied up 20,000 Japanese troops. Clandestine special operations agents attacked Japanese targets in the islands and even in Indochina. In 1943, in the famous Operation Jaywick, Australians sailed an old Japanese fishing boat, the Crate, to Singapore Harbour and sank 37,000 tonnes of Japanese shipping. But when World War II ended in 1945, Britain and Australia disbanded their SAS commando and special units. But this strange triumph of reactionary over progressive thinking was short-lived. In 1947, as the Cold War with Communist Russia deepened, Britain revived SAS, but only as a part-time unit, merged with the colourful Artist Rifles, a much-decorated World War I volunteer infantry battalion of painters, sculptors, writers and musicians. Founded on the Elizabethan ideal of the versatile Renaissance man, veterans included the flamboyant writer and actor Sir Noel Coward, famous poet Wilfred Owen, and the ingenious Sir Barnes Wallis, inventor of the Dam Buster's bouncing bomb. As the Cold War in Europe became the hot war in Asia, communist insurgency spread throughout Southeast Asia. In the long Malayan anti-terrorist campaign, volunteers from Britain's 21st SAS artists, fighting as the Malayan Scouts SAS, showed how terrorists could be beaten in the jungle. But in 1954, the unthinkable happened. Communist Viet Minh captured the French fortress at Dien Bien Phu in Indochina, reviving Western fears of the domino theory. Historically, European Australians have feared invasion from the so-called Asian Yellow Peril.
Does anybody with his five wits doubt that before very long, Chinese communism, acting through North Vietnamese communism, would sweep down through South Vietnam, and we would find ourselves with aggressive communism almost on our shores, just across the water from us?
Lobbying began for an Australian SAS. The lobbyists argued that Australians were temperamentally suited to unconventional warfare. Australians were independent, aggressive, and preferred attack to defence. They were highly motivated and could tolerate much hardship and deprivation. In the rising tension, in 1955, New Zealand raised a small SAS unit. In the same year, Australia finally reintroduced Special Forces. Not an SAS unit, but the cheaper option of two part-time citizen units, one commando company in Sydney and two commando company in Melbourne. In 1956, the Australian Military Board wrote, "In Malaya, SAS units are proving of great value in jungle penetration. They can be dropped into areas virtually inaccessible to other ground forces. Here they establish liaison with local tribesmen, gain information on enemy activities, and take rapid punitive action. They dominate the area in which they operate." In 1957, the Australian government made a far-reaching decision. It formed a full-time Special Air Service company of about 140 men based near Perth. But the advent of SAS was not very promising. In its ignorance, the Army gave the new SAS less equipment than an infantry rifle company. The Army Office had no guidelines or rationale for the new unit.
The weapons were still the old 303 from World War II, the Owen machine carbine and the 303 Bren gun. But the interesting part about it was that there was a real mixture of ideas about where we're going to. We were based a little bit on the independent companies, the commando companies from World War II, and from some of the influence of 22 SAS and some of the special operations groups that operated in World War II.
The philosopher Marshall McLuhan said, "We drive into the future, looking into the rear vision mirror." Clearly, if the Australian SAS was to amount to anything, it would have to invent itself.
When I first arrived in SAS in 1962, there was an underwriting feeling that we would never be used. There'd be no role for SAS at that time. In fact, we looked on the rest of the Army in a sort of derogatory fashion as something of cowboys. And occasionally you get the odd term, SAS stood for shit and shiver.
Since its formation in 1957, SAS had been training hard and working hard, and soldiers had become multi-skilled, but for no particular purpose. And by the end of 1964, there was a highly trained, multi-skilled, confident group of officers and soldiers, but yet to prove themselves. And so that opportunity was something that was being looked for by SAS.
But in the early 1960s, Southeast Asia became a series of flashpoints. Tension mounted when Indonesia's President Sukarno denounced the new anti-communist Federation of Malaysia as neo-colonialist and announced Konfrontasi, undeclared war against Malaysia. Vietnam was also deteriorating. In August 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox. Congress authorized American escalation in Vietnam. Responding to the heightened tension, Australia expanded its defence force. In September 1964, SAS Company became SAS Regiment. With its legendary Sandy Beret and its famous motto, "Who dares wins." An SAS regiment was more likely to survive politically than a mere SAS company. But in the coming conflicts in Southeast Asia, at stake would be the reputation of the fledgling SAS regiment. Operational failure could spell the end of SAS as a new strategic movement within the Australian Army.